It's time to go back to a familiar segment we've done before called Deependopedia, as we discuss the real roots, of modern racism. Deependopedia. So let's talk about this. Modern racism. I'm not talking about racism that existed as it always has throughout human history, including in this country. I'm talking about the 20th century racism that produced Jim Crow, that produced segregation, redlining, and all those kind of things. Where did it come from? Where did this idea that white people are superior to black people or other people, where did that idea come from? And the answer is going to surprise you. The answer is going to shock you. Guess where it came from? It came from a guy named Charles Darwin. Yeah, Charles Darwin, who I have talked about on the deep end before. Charles Darwin is a darling of atheists and agnostics the world over because Charles Darwin produced the scientific thoughts and reasons necessary to eliminate God from the equation of our origins. And I want to quote a paper today on the deep end. Again, jam-packed with information today. The paper is called The Dark Side of Darwinism. It's by Austin Anderson, and he writes about how racism and racist thoughts, the racist thought of the 20th century, really the 19th century, was the byproduct of Darwin's theories. So he writes about this. Charles Darwin was a 19th century English nationalist, is known as one of the most brilliant minds in history. He was a curious intellectual and a brave adventurer, well-liked by those who knew him personally and greatly revered in the scientific community. His 1859 and 1871 books on the origin of species and the descent of man enlightened the world with a transformative understanding of life that became the foundation of modern biological thought.
But there's a dark side
to Darwin, a side that perhaps calls into question his prized intellect and cherished legacy. Darwin's writing was racist, and discriminatory beliefs and practices followed directly from his theories. If you're a lover of evolution or a biology major like I am, you may be tempted to reject that claim, but hear me out. Support for the idea that Darwin's theories are racist may come from where you least expect it. Charles Darwin, in his book, The Descent of Man, Darwin applies the theories of natural selection to humans and introduces the idea of sexual selection. And Austin writes about this. Darwin describes Australians, Mongolians, Africans, Indians, South Americans, Polynesians, and even Eskimos as savages in his own writings. Darwin consistently elevates white Europeans above savages. Darwin explains that the highest races and the lowest savages differ in, quote, moral disposition and in intellect. Darwin says the savages have low morality, insufficient powers of reasoning, and weak power of self-command. That's from page 97 of The Descent of Man, written by Charles Darwin. He also justifies violent imperialism. Quote, from the remotest times, successful tribes have supplanted other tribes. This is him writing. At the present day, civilized nations are everywhere supplanting barbarous nations. He writes that the Western nations of Europe now so immeasurably surpass their former savage progenitors and stand at the summit of civilization, end quote. That's just one source. I take you to another source. This is from a piece called
Darwin, Race, and Gender.
And I have all the sources documented here below on the screen for you if you're watching. This paper was written by a guy named Stephen Rose, and he writes about how Darwin was convinced that evolution was progressive and that the white races, especially the Europeans, were revolutionary, more advanced than the black races, thus establishing race differences and a racial hierarchy. By the way, ladies, Darwin was also a rabid sexist. He stated that the result of sexualization is for men to be, quote, more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than women, with a more inventive genius. The man's brain is absolutely larger. The formation of her skull is said to be intermediate between the child and the man. And people say the Bible is sexist. Oh, so funny. He enthusiastically endorsed his cousin Francis Galton's view of hereditary genius transmitted down the male line. And he also nodded cautiously toward eugenics. The next batch of material that I have about Charles Darwin comes from a book called From Darwin to Hitler. This book, you actually can hardly purchase this book. The picture on the screen is kind of like this cropped picture of the first page because it's out of print and you can only buy old copies of it. Richard Weikart writes, Darwinism by itself did not produce the Holocaust, but without Darwinism, neither Hitler nor his Nazi followers would have had the necessary scientific underpinnings to convince themselves and their collaborators that one of the world's greatest atrocities was really morally praiseworthy. In other words, you don't get the Holocaust without Darwin. He also writes, Darwinism undermined traditional morality and the value of human life. Evolutionary progress became the new moral imperative. This aided the advance of eugenics, which is overtly founded on Darwinian principles. Some eugenicists began advocating euthanasia and infanticide for the disabled. On a parallel track, some prominent Darwinists argued that human racial competition in war is part of the Darwinian struggle for existence. Hitler imbibed these social Darwinist ideas, blended in virulent anti-Semitism, and there you have it, Holocaust. So you've got to know some of the facts here. You've got to see how philosophies that
are rooted in science
in the 19th century became the realities of horror in the 20th century. You don't get Hitler, you don't get the Aryan superior race theory without the theory of the survival of the fittest, or the natural selection theory, which believes that the natural order, because it can't be created by anybody, the natural order of the world shows us that the fittest animals survive. It naturally makes sense that the fittest races survive. And this theory finds itself in Germany in the 1900s, because you have to fight to stay alive. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to check out more content from the channel, you can click here or you can go here. Oh, and I also preach on the weekends, and if you'd like to watch some of that, it's right here. Thanks for being here.